Welcome back into the Daily Dose. I'm Jeff Hansen. The show is brought to you by Give'emHellBrigham.com and by CougarSportsInsider.com, part of the 24/7 Sports Network. We've blown past 2,500 subscribers, and we are cruising towards 3,000 subscribers. Thank you to all of you who have fueled the algorithm and helped us expedite our growth here on the channel. Please continue to do so. Appreciate your support. Means a lot to me. Coach Holgorsen, the head coach, Dana Holgorsen at Houston, he made a comment during Big 12 Media Days this week that really stood out to me. And we've talked about it a lot, us here, about what it means for BYU. And we've seen other conversations kind of at an anecdotal micro level of what it means for individual teams. But Coach Holgorsen talked about this topic, and he did it at a macro level of what teams across the country are going to be dealing with as fall camp approaches. Coach Holgorsen talked about the influx of new players to his team. He was asked and said, "Hey, Coach, how's your team look? What do you think you're going to have this fall?" And Coach Holgorsen said, "I don't know." Talked about how his entire coaching career, he knew what he would have in spring ball. So he could install and he could game plan and he could go really physical throughout his spring practices, knowing full well that his team would have time to recover. And that's the team that would be there on the fall or in the fall. And you could go physical in the spring because you needed to. You needed to test your guys. You needed to see who could stand out, who could take, who was going to win position battles. And the best way to do that was with tough physical practices. Okay, well, now teams are adding so many players from the transfer portal after spring ball that you don't really know who you've got. Coach Holgorsen talked about it, that he's adding 28 new guys since spring. That's a combination of high school players and transfer portal players, of course. But 28 new guys that's a quarter of the roster. That's a good chunk of what you're working with. And the transfer portal element of that is that these are guys who you're expecting to count on. You think you know what you have based on film, but you haven't seen them in your system, in your facilities, with the physicality that you want as a head coach. So Coach Holgorsen talked about what that means for fall camp going into the season. Says that coaches are going to have to figure out a new balance. He wasn't complaining. This is something every coach is dealing with. It's just new and different. But he said every coach is going to have to figure out a new balance. Instead of a week of kind of ramp up and then another week of slower ramp up, and then maybe you get physical for a week in fall camp before you start game prep, you've got to figure out who's on your roster. Some coaches, in his estimation, are probably going to go too hard, too fast, and they're going to have more injuries in fall camp this year. He said some other coaches are probably not going to go hard enough or fast enough, physical enough in fall camp, and they're not going to know what they have in week 1 and week 2 of the season, and it's going to be kind of learning on the fly. What is the balance? Where is the balance? Nobody really seems to know, because this is the first year of transfers like this. The transfer portal's been around a couple of years, but this is full scale, everybody across the country adding, 10, 15 transfer portal guys that you're expecting to make an impact. That's going to be really interesting to see how coaches handle that. Now, BYU, that's going to be a big storyline. I don't want to say a big problem, but a big storyline for the Cougars as fall camp approaches. And we're getting close to fall camp. Players will report on July 31st. We're 2 weeks away from players reporting to fall camp. Football is almost here. BYU, in their almanac that they released to the media during Big 12 Media Days, they listed 55 newcomers that will join the roster. That's a combination of high school freshmen. That's a combination of transfers, return missionaries, but 55 new players. Now, some of those guys were there for spring ball, but 55 new players is a ton. And how is Kalani Sitake going to figure out what his transition period looks like? When does he decide that he's going to play really physical? How does he learn what his team has? We talked about it in the spring. Jay Hill ran one of the most physical spring balls that Coach Sitake had seen in his career. It's clear that Jay Hill needs to know who he's got on the defensive side of the ball. Is he going to do that all over again in fall camp with another influx of new transfers? On the surface, that sounds great. Physical fall camp sounds fantastic. But our injuries going to pile up. Our guys going to get fatigued, and maybe they're more susceptible to an injury in week 5 or week 6. These are all new elements that we've got to understand. Coaches have got to start to figure out, and that we as fans just get to ride along and watch. But it is going to have an impact on the field throughout the season. I think this is going to be one of the more fascinating storylines, injuries, just in general, going to be one of the more fascinating storylines in the first month and a half of the season, because I think we might see more as coaches try to figure out where that balance is. Across the conference, this is something that's normal. I included Arkansas just because they're on BYU's schedule, but the teams that BYU is going to play, they're all dealing with the same thing. Arkansas added 19 transfers, Kansas 12, Cincinnati 21, TCU 13, Texas Tech 7, Texas 5, West Virginia 14, Oklahoma 16, Oklahoma State 13. The only school that really isn't relying on a ton of transfers, at least according to the way that 24/7 Sports lists it, is Iowa State. They added just 2. But everybody else on BYU's schedule is going to be kind of figuring out the same thing that BYU has to deal with. How do you work these transfers into your scheme? How do you protect their health? How do you protect them from being fatigued? But how do you figure out what you've got so that you know who to play and how? It's going to be really interesting to watch. And to me, it's one of the biggest storylines that nobody is talking about as fall camp is just a little over 2 weeks away. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your Saturday to spend with us here at the Daily Dose. Until next time, give them hell.